Boa tarde, galera cervejeira. Sejam todos bem-vindos de volta ao nosso Congresso Técnico online da Agraria Malte. Estamos iniciando hoje nosso último dia, para a tristeza de muitos aí, nossa 13ª palestra e às 19 horas a última, nossa 14ª palestra. Hoje um dia inteiro com nossos grandes parceiros da Lallemand. Vocês já estão vendo aqui na tela, junto comigo aí, o Lucas que é o técnico da Lallemand aqui no Brasil. O Lucas é mestre cervejeiro e beer sommelier, já trabalhou com a gente aqui na Agraria e hoje é o técnico responsável pelo atendimento da Lallemand aqui no Brasil. Também está com a gente para nos ajudar aí no chat e no Ask a Question, a Ludmila e a Vitória, e nos bastidores, né, vão estar respondendo aí vocês. E como eu já falei agora há pouco do Ask a Question, para quem tiver alguma dúvida, pessoal, técnica aí para fazer pro palestrante, só clicar ali no Ask a Question e pode perguntar ali. Ao final da palestra, o Lucas vai estar transmitindo essas perguntas para o nosso palestrante que está lá na Itália. Pessoal, para quem perdeu as outras, ou as nossas palestras anteriores, as 12 palestras, além de poder rever aí no Crowdcast mesmo, as 12 palestras já estão no canal da Agraria Malte no YouTube. Então entra lá no YouTube, se inscreve lá no nosso canal, no canal da Agraria Malte, e você já vai poder rever as 12 palestras anteriores, e também tem diversos outros vídeos nossos lá bem bacana. Então, sem me retardar mais aqui, vou passar a palavra para o Lucas. Não, já apresentei o Lucas. O Lucas vai estar dando as boas-vindas para vocês aí também, e vai estar apresentando o Gianmaria, que é o nosso palestrante de agora, que vai estar falando sobre a levedura Voss Kveik. É isso, Lucas?
Bom, boa tarde, pessoal. O Rodrigo já falou de mim, então meu nome é Lucas, eu trabalho com a Lallemand aqui no Brasil. Já estou há 5 anos, estamos trabalhando com as leveduras da Lallemand no mercado brasileiro, fazendo todas as revendas através da Agraria, que é nosso parceiro já há 11 anos. Tá? E agora nós vamos então participar desse congresso e vamos trazer 2 apresentações. Então a primeira que a gente vai ver agora à tarde é do Gianmaria. Então ele é a pessoa da Lallemand Brewing lá na Itália, ele atende Itália e Eslovênia. Tá? Ele vai fazer a apresentação dele em inglês. Então quem tiver qualquer dúvida pode mandar ali no Ask a Question em inglês ou em português, que a gente repassa para ele. Tá ok? Hello, Gianmaria. We already introduced you, so the floor is yours. You can start.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, even if I didn't get any word from it. So, bom dia a todos. That's all my Portuguese for now. So, I'm going to switch quite straightforward to my presentation. I hope you can see my screen and hear me well. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen, guys?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for having me here. It's a great opportunity to be at least virtually in Brazil. I've never been there, so it's a great chance to be there with you today. As my colleagues introduced me and introduced this talk for today, we are going to discuss briefly about the characteristic of our yeast, and of course one of our recent release in the market, what we call Voss Kveik ale yeast. I'm not Norwegian, so I'm not sure if it's the right pronunciation is Kveik or Kveik. I don't know. We'll understand each other for today. I'm going briefly to introduce myself before starting. My name is Gianmaria Ricciardi. I'm based in Italy, and I work for Lallemand Brewing as a technical sales manager, covering for Italy and part of the Balkans country. And as we usually say, we brew with you with our motto. We means that most of our time we spend it with brewers, supporting them on field, and of course attending workshop events and seminars. And today, for the reason that we all know, we moved online as well. So thanks to these webinars and talks online. What do I like mostly in my life? It's of course beer and brewing. It's already over 10 years that I've been spending my time, my professional time in brewing. So I started as a head brewer in several breweries in Italy and in the UK, and now working since 2.5 years with Lallemand Brewing. As I mentioned, we are going to start briefly discussing about Lallemand Brewing as a company, and then we'll move quite quickly to the production of active dry yeast and all the quality control checks that we run in our process, just to give you some basic information about how we work and how we reach continuously new strain, and how we are able to develop and release new strains such as the Voss Kveik yeast that we recently launched on the market. So then we move through the history and the origins of Kveik, in general speaking, going deeper into the selection that Lallemand have been running in terms of these specific strains that we introduce in our portfolio. At the end of the talk, we will discuss and spend some time looking at the lab trials that we run, and of course some field trials that we run in thanks to some brewers that help us to gather a lot of information about these new strains. And of course, we will have time for further question Q&A later on at the end of this presentation. As you probably know, Lallemand is a big company, including different business units, and of course, brewing is part of it. It started its business in the latest of the 19th century, so in the 1870s. And brewing is Lallemand Brewing is of course a very important part of this of the company, and started its business in the early years of the 70s, actually producing and selecting yeast for the homebrewing market. So we were providing brewing yeast for the homebrewing kits. Then after year, we developed and of course selected a lot of new strains. We moved through the acquisition of the Siebel Institute of Technologies based in Chicago, and the Abbey Vickers based in the UK, that gave us the opportunity to improve our offer, not only in terms of yeast and bacteria, but also in terms of services and instruction and formation. Now we are basically proud to have in line in our portfolio 14 different strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae in our Lal Brew premium series, and in our Wild Brew series we've got we recently introduced actually another strains of yeast. So we've got 3 products on that line. But talking in particular and discussing in particular about dry yeast, we all know that basically we are talking about yeast, as the word says, yeast that has been dried up to 95% of dry matter. This process is quite tricky for us because not all the strains can afford and these stressing environments. But at the same time, once we get the yeast in this condition, in this form, we are able to work with a very robust and stable product, which gave us the opportunity to run a lot of different analyses on it and ensure the constancy and the performances that this yeast could have in during the fermentation when it will be in the right condition in the brewery. We usually store our yeast in two different ways, mainly on agasse lands, where when we have to move the yeast quickly from our lab to our production plants, and those are the small files that you may have seen around. And then when we want to store them for a longer time in order to keep the integrity and the characteristic of the yeast for a quite long time, we opt to freeze them in order to keep this condition unchanged. I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to move quite quickly through these slides because I'm pretty sure that you're pretty familiar with dry yeast production. But this is just to give you an idea that when we're talking about production of yeast production, we are not so far from what we usually do and control and check in a brewery environment. In fact, when we want to produce yeast, we want, of course, keep in mind that we are interested in producing biomass and more yeast. But what we have to control as well in the meantime are all the other different variables or aspects, such as nutrients content, pH, ethanol production, temperature control, CO2 production, as well as the oxygen intake. All these factors, of course, are something similar that is usually controlled and checked in the brewing process, but of course with different standards. In fact, we want to limit as much as possible the production of ethanol and CO2, but we want rather to focus on the increase of the growth factor, so produce as much as possible biomass. How we do that? Maybe most of you have already tried at home or in yeast breweries what we generally call as propagation. And that stage and that process, it can be represented on the left side of this graph, where you basically pitch a certain amount of yeast in a quite rich sugary environment. The yeast, of course, start to metabolize the sugar and consume them, as you can see from the green line. It reproduces itself of a certain amount, but not more than 3-4 folds. And at the same time, it produces alcohol. It doesn't matter how much oxygen we provide to the yeast at this stage, it will ferment. This is because the yeast metabolism has been selected for many years, for centuries and millennia, that actually the yeast it's not able to do otherwise. So even if we put the yeast we provide the yeast with oxygen, it would prefer to ferment rather than respire or reproduce. This is what we called trap-tree effect. So in order to avoid and limit this effect as much as possible, we have to feed the yeast little by little. In fact, we pitch the yeast in a good nutrient environment, but we dose, especially sugars, little by little in order to limit as much as possible the production of alcohol and CO2 and increase exponentially the production of the biomass. So we stimulate the yeast to reproduce to respire rather than ferment. Say that, I want to just show you very quickly the flow sheet of a classic dry yeast production. So as we mentioned, we start from the lab with a pure cultures. We do some scale ups in order to reach enough biomass to be pitched into the heart of the process, which is the bioreactor. In this bioreactor, we are able to dose and feed the yeast with sugars coming from peat or cane molasses and other nutrients such as nitrogen compounds, minerals, vitamins, and of course, oxygen at this stage. The nutrition and the oxygen requirement and the speed of reproduction is very strain dependent. So each strain requires different nutrients, different times, different variations. So this is basically part of our R&D team work that basically work constantly to try to characterizing our strains in order to produce a much more efficient yeast and performance in yeast. When the enough biomass is reached, so enough yeast is reached after this stage takes about 24 48 hours, straight dependent, as I said. We move to the next steps where we try to remove as much as possible the water content into the slurry. And from the stage of the creamy yeast is where our process differ from our other lab yeast producers. In fact, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, drying the yeast is the most critical point of the process. So it's the bottleneck of our process. In fact, not all the strains are able to support to pass through this process. And one of the hardest work and goal of our production is actually bring the yeast to this step in its optimum. In its optimum, and this is made thanks to some kind of stressor factors that we can control during the process in order to encourage the yeast to produce some natural and protectors such as trehalose, sterols, fatty acids that are all compounds that helps us during the process of the drying to keep the integrity of the cells and keep high vitality in the final product. So once the yeast has been dried, it has packed into the final package, and we are able, as I said, to run a lot of different analyses. We run a bunch of 26 different analyses on each batch, actually on a double row. So 52 analyses in total. And this is thanks to the stability of the product that we are working on. Analysis such as, of course, vitality, viability, contamination, so wild yeast, bacteria, genetic tests. So we release our yeast only when there is a 100% matching into from what we produce to what we have in storage in our culture collection in our yeast bank. And of course we have time to run also some fermentation, forced fermentation, for monitoring the lag phase, for instance, the level of attenuation, the rate of attenuation, cell counts, but also some flavor aspects through a trained panel that we've got in our company. So that's basically an introduction just to show you how important is knowing exactly what we are feeling and working with in terms of, as I said, characterization of the strain itself, but also keep improving the technologies and the knowledge behind the yeast production. And this helped us in the recent years to launch a lot of different new strains. And so we can say that our family is literally growing. And one of the recent yeast that we launched in the market is exactly Lallemand Voss Kveik Ale yeast. So going a little bit more deeper into into what Kveik is. It's basically a Norwegian word, because geographically, when we're talking about Kveik, we are talking about a specific area in the globe that is based in the Scandinavian countries, in particular in Norway. So in Norway, they've got this dialect word that is Kveik, which means literally yeast, or in a more romantic way, starting a new life into something, referring probably to the fermentation, to the start of the fermentation. And this Kveik has been passed from generation to generation for the last few centuries, and it's basically made of a mix of different cultures. A mix of different cultures, I mean, it's mainly made of different strains of Saccharomyces, as we will see later, but there are some Kveik that contain as well non-Saccharomyces, as well as bacteria, as we will see later. And the interesting aspect of these cultures and these traditions is that this yeast has been preserved and stored in a dry form. In most of the areas has been stored in a dry form, which is a great aspect, of course, for a dry manufacturing company like Lallemand Brewing. In other regions of the country, there were different ways of storing them, like in a creamy or liquid form. On the bottom left of this slide, you can see the wood ring that it has been used for centuries to harvest, collect, and dry the yeast, and reuse and repeat it into the new and coming batches. Of course, the origin of the genetic origin of these strains is still to be researched. Even if I will show you a slide discussing about the genetic behind this yeast, but of course, in terms of the actors that play an important role into this tradition, we have, of course, to thank all the Norwegian brewing community that has been kind enough to share with us and the rest of the world, of course, of this specific yeast and strains. One specific rule is played by Lars Krasel. That is the godfather of this Kveik revolution, if we can call like that. And if you haven't already done it, I invite you to click on the link and visit his website. That is a very interesting journey through the Kveik world. We also released an interview with Krasel that is available on our YouTube channel. So if you are interested to see and to know a little bit more specifically on Kveik, generally speaking, you can go on our YouTube channel, Lallemand Brewing, and see what we discussed about. As I mentioned, genetically speaking, we classified the Kveik family yeast into a specific category of brewing yeast. If you want to read a little bit more, you've got the references on the bottom of this slide to read a very interesting article regarding this study. But what I want to just highlight in this presentation is what we know regarding the genetic of our common strains that we usually use in our breweries. And we generally classify brewing yeast into different categories: Beer 1 and Beer 2. Beer 1 is where all the Belgium, Germany, US, and Britain's strains fall in. So where the saison yeast, for instance, fall into the beer two groups. And we know that Kveik yeast, for their specific fermentation characteristic, fermentation kinetics, and different and other different aspects, fell in between these two categories, because they've got a lot in common with some European clean yeast, because these yeasts are quite clean, but at the same time they share other things in common with other strains of yeast, the big family of the saison yeast, in terms of speed of fermentation, temperature tolerance, since they can work at very high temperature. But at the same time, they don't share with them other aspects that are characteristic and typical for saison yeast, such as diastaticus characteristics, or they don't produce any phenolic of flavor, what is known as positive strains. So we can say that basically Kveik fall into beer one group, but are actually older than all the strains that we been commonly used so far. And so we can consider that basically Kveik strains, Kveik yields, are kind of the ancestors of all the strains that we are usually and commonly used in our breweries. So already starting discussing about the genetic of Kveik, we already realized how complex this world and this environment is, and we faced this complexity in our lab when we started to analyze different cultures of mixed cultures of Kveik. We started from 10 different Kveik family, and we identified, growing them on different media, that they were, as I mentioned at the beginning, they were built up on different strains and different microorganisms, such as Saccharomyces, non-Saccharomyces, as well as bacteria. In fact, when we run the first test, starting from the 10 different mixed cultures on different media, we were able to identify that there were, to be precise, 31 strains of 31 Saccharomyces cerevisiae, 7 bacteria, and 4 non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Then we went a little bit further, analyzed them from a genetic point of view. So thanks to the use of PCR, we focus our attention and our study on the Saccharomyces cerevisiae ones, and we identified and we saw that basically there were some of these strains that shared most of the DNA traits in common, and so they basically were identical strains, even if they were present in different Kveik of original Kveik from completely different area in the country. And this is quite easily explained because the Norwegian tradition of sharing Kveik is not that recent. So recently it has been spread all over the world, but in Norway it has been always the same. So the different farmhouse brewers were used to share each other the yeast, because sometimes maybe they lost the cultures, they damage it, or they wanted just to refresh the culture. So they have been mixing different yeast from their neighborhoods to each other, and this made basically this huge complexity that we've been facing during our selection. In fact, as you can see here, from the 10 different cultures, mixed cultures, we ended up with 31 Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but some of them were matching each other, so we ended up with 19 different Kveik and single strains Saccharomyces cerevisiae. As you can see here, another interesting picture just to give you an overview on the complexity that we've been discussing so far in terms of morphology, the morphology of the colony itself. In fact, growing the different yeast on different media, we immediately understood that we were dealing with a huge variety in terms of color. For instance, we spotted green colony as well as white colony, pale colony, big or smaller colonies, as well as with a smooth surface or a rough surface, especially for the wild yeast, as well as bacteria, as I mentioned before. So this picture gave us the idea of how complex this world was, and how many different applications can be made in selecting these specific strains. After identifying and isolating a single strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, we decided to move into the lab trials. So starting to analyze and perform this yeast that we just isolated into some lab wort. We worked with a standard wort 12 Platos, as well as high gravity worts 18 Platos, and we fermented our trials at two different temperatures, at 20 and 30 Celsius degrees. Of course, during the fermentation, we daily checked all the parameters such as the drop in gravity and pH, as well as the sugar profile at the beginning and at the end of the fermentation, thanks to the HPLC, or also the flavor profile produced by this yeast in terms of esters and fusel alcohols, thanks to gas chromatography. And what we received from these trials was, again, a huge mix of different fermentation kinetics, different fermentation and flavor profile. So as you can see, there were some that were more attenuative, some others that were less attenuative, some that were puff positive, some others more fruity, some others neutrals, some other quicker in fermenting, some other a little bit slower. So we decided to move and select at the end of all these trials what we produced and launched on the market with the commercial name of Lallemand Voss, these specific strains, because was the most representative of this huge and diverse environment and world of Kveik strains. But at the same time, it kept the same and the most important characteristic of the original Kveik yeast in terms of fermentation temperature tolerance. In fact, as you can see, it ferments and performs very well in a wide range of fermentation from 25 up to 40 Celsius degrees. Of course, higher the temperature, the fermentation temperature is, and the quicker the fermentation is. So if we go up to 40 degrees Celsius degrees, we can have and reach the final attenuation within 2 days, so a little bit more. And of course, if we go lower, the fermentation lasts longer. At the same time, working with a single strain, and I want to stress this aspect, that we've been selecting a single strains originally coming from a multicultural environment, help us and gave us the chance to have a very constant product, and we are able to reproduce and propagate time after time always the same product. Another interesting characteristic of these strains, generally speaking, is the high flocculation performances. But we will spend a little bit more, a few words more in details regarding flocculation and what can happen in the finished product. As I said, it can perform in a quite wide range of temperature, but the optimum and the ideal temperature, fermentation temperature, is between 37 up to 39 Celsius degrees, both in terms of speed of fermentation and flavor profile production. As you can see from this slide, took from our brewing catalog, is actually some other interesting quick facts on these strains, such as the alcohol tolerance. As you can see, it's a quite robust strains, and actually we had some feedbacks that were reporting that it can support and face even higher alcohol concentration. So it performs very well in high gravity worlds. But on the other hand, on the right side of these slides, you can see also the flavor wheel, where you can see how neutral this yeast is, even if it has a slightly estery hint of orangey peel or anyway citrusy notes that match perfectly, for instance, with all the hoppy beer, American hoppy beer style that you wish to brew. But at the same time, the neutrality of the strain allow us to apply it, as we will see later, on a very, very huge range of beer styles that you can brew with these specific strains. In this graph, I want just to show you the results of the fermentation kinetics that we achieved during our trial. As you can see, we've got the results starting from fermentation temperature of 15, both in 12 and 18 Platos, up to 14 Celsius degrees, both in 12 and 18 Platos. As you can see from these slides, it performed very well in the fermentation range up from 20, 25 up to 40 Celsius degrees, as I mentioned. And you can notice that not a change in attenuation rate was showed in both worlds. So it doesn't matter if you're working in a very weak or low gravity world, or in a very high concentrated and high gravity world, it will perform quite well, reaching about 80% of attenuation. The only case where we notice a decrease in the attenuation rate was when we fermented below 20 degrees. So going lower than 15, of course, it affects not only the speed of the fermentation itself, but also the attenuation rate. Translating this from our lab trials into what we experienced from our field trials, we basically confirmed what we discovered and we analyzed in our labs. In fact, we reached and obtained an attenuation rate of in between 78 up to 82%. We just had one exception from our trial made reach in a sour IPA. As you can see, we reached roughly 68% of attenuation, and that wasn't due to the low pH, because as I'll show you later, there were other sour IPA or sour beer made with Kveik not being affected at all by the sour mesh or the sourness present in the wort, but rather because this specific beer and this specific trial was meshed at a quite high temperature. So the attenuation was a result of quite high meshing temperature. The fermentation kinetics confirmed that this yeast is a very quick fermenting yeast. In fact, we had the longer fermentation took about 5 days, but it's because the yeast was pitched at 40 Celsius degrees, but due to a lack of insulation of the fermenter, the temperature dropped to 20 Celsius degrees quite quickly, especially because the trials was made in winter, so the cold environment, of course, dropped the temperature quite aggressively. But at the same time, we had great results with the beer fermented in a little bit more than 2 days, in 49.5 hours. The finish attenuation, the final attenuation was reached, and as you can see, it was a double batch brew in 2 days in a row. So of course, the double batch always help to improve and speed up the fermentation. Another interesting aspect regarding the fermentation is also the drop in pH. Being a very, let's say, aggressive or anyway performing yeast, it tends to drop the pH quite quickly. So if you want to control and to limit this drop a little bit more, I recommend you to start with a slightly higher pH after the boiling, at the end of the boiling, in order to modulate and to reduce the reduction of the pH. That can play an interesting and important role also in the condensation of different compounds present in the beer, especially in hoppy beer, such as proteins or polyphenols coming from malt and hops. We recommend as well a pitching rate of 50-100 grams per hectoliter, so pretty much the same pitching rate that we recommend for our ale strains, because it's true from some point of view that Kveik yeast performs very well when under pitched, but we don't really know what underpitching means in the Kveik world, because as we saw in the previous slides, the way of drying the yeast, the way of storing the yeast originally and traditionally, it wasn't the best and the cleanest way in the world. So that means that the brewers don't know exactly the vitality of the yeast and constancy of the yeast itself during the storage. So from our studies, we saw that at this pitching rate, it performs pretty well. In terms of flavor profile, as we said, there was no hint of any of flavor. It was rather quite clean, slightly fruity, with this orangey peel essence and notes. The attenuation was most of the time, in between 78 to 82%, and that's some repetition on the slide. So sorry for the repetition, but we covered, I think, most of its characteristics. Then, sorry for this busy slide, but I just wanted to show you and highlight some of the trials that we've been making before the launch of this product. As you can see, we moved from a quite weak gravity words, from 90.5 up to 16 Plators, and the attenuation rate was in between the range that we experience in our lab. Fermentation time as well is pretty much in standard from what we analyzed, in between 2 up to 5 days. From this slide, you can see that most of the trials were made on sour beer, sour IPA, or anyway hoppy beer, with all the declination of IPA styles. But I haven't reported that some data on this slide, but I can tell you that our colleagues in Spain, for instance, had great feedback and has been reported of great trials made on dark beer as well, such as Russian Imperial Stout, where that was brewed with the Voss, and it performed very well on that environment as well. So dark beer, dark malt, roasted malt, and high gravity beer, again, it's a confirmation that this yeast is a very robust one and it's not affected at all from harsh condition. Here, just to report to you some other great feedbacks, not only in terms of data, but also in terms of the quotes that and the words that the brewers spent for these strains. For instance, on the left side, we got a Kveik IPA brewed by Glen Affric, where the brewer, Matt, just said that you can really smell the tangerine notes of this yeast, very fruity, no hint of any of flavors, as we said. You would associate with high temperature fermentation and stress, very clean and fresh. So that's confirmed that how, despite fermenting at such high temperature, you can reach a very clean and vibrant profile. On the other side, on the right side of this slide, we've got another interesting trials, both from the flavor profile that the brewer reached using Voss, but also for the characteristic brew that has been made with these trials. In fact, it is a sour IPA, and the brewer basically brewed the beer, and rather to make a sour mash, he moved and chilled the beer wort up to 35 Celsius degrees and move it straight away into the FV, into the fermenter, where he pitched our sour pitch, which is our Lactobacillus plantarum, and let it ferment for about 24 hours. That, of course, produced a quite interesting amount of lactic acid. And after that, for 24 hours, they pitched the Voss that could ferment at the same temperature, so at such high temperature of 35 Celsius degrees. And basically, at that temperature, it fermented wort in less than 2 days. So basically, the result of these trials was that they were able to produce a sour IPA in less than 3 days. And as quoting the head brewer, Matt, again, he said, the ester produced by these yeasts worked well in this beer. They complemented the use of Northwest American hops perfectly. The flavors produced by fermentations were clean and vibrant, something not normally common with such hot fermentations. And this is, again, a confirmation of the different huge application that you can achieve with these specific strains and this specific yeast. In fact, just discussing about the objective of this product and the application that you can make and achieve with this specific yeast, you can easily understand now that this yeast is basically addressed to any kind of brewers, starting from home brewing and home brewers up to professional brewers, from small craft brewers up to bigger brewers. And of course, this allowed us not to have a strictly control of fermentation temperature temperatures during our process. And that of course is a great help again for home brewers, for instance, that cannot control so in detail the temperature of their beer, as well as in some cases also for craft breweries. As we saw in the example, we had a trials made with a brewery that weren't able to control and monitoring the fermentation temperature during the fermentation itself. The example where the temperature dropped from 40 up to 20 Celsius degrees, but the brewers was able to achieve the end of the fermentation within 5 days anyway. Of course, being able to produce very clean beers with not off flavors or not any kind of flavors unless than slightly estery and citrusy notes, we are basically can use this yeast for any kind of beer style, starting from the more traditional farmhouse ales in the Norwegian styles of Kveik farmhouse ales, but also brewing neutral ales such as golden ale or pale ale, as well as hoppy beer such as IPAs, for instance. That's just an example of how wide the range of beer style can be. Most of the brewers that are just fell in love with this yeast are actually using it for brewing New England IPAs, for instance, thanks to the ability of create a quite stable turbidity and haziness in the beer when fermented in a very hoppy and protein environment at such high temperature. And of course, on the other hand, you can have some other advantages of using this yeast, not only in terms of flavor profile that you can reach and achieve, but also in terms of performances, technology performances. In fact, you can basically chill the beer wort at warmer temperature compared to a classic ale beer. In fact, if you have to pitch your yeast at 35 or 40 Celsius degrees, you don't have to chill the beer wort lower than that. And this helps to save, of course, time during the chilling, but also money in terms of cooling the wort itself. And you have to also to consider that there are some parts of the world, some regions in the world where the summer are quite long, and I guess that in some area of your countries you can experience that, where it's really hard to cool the beer down up to a certain temperature, and this could be a great solution on that point of view. On the other side, speeding up the fermentation during the process, you can of course basically speed up the turnover of your cellar, increasing basically the capacity of your cellar or your brewery without adding any extra vessel, but just reducing the fermentation times. So all these aspects, of course, are of great interest for of this yeast, and you can see how this can be used not only for its flavor and specific characteristics, and also because it comes from a very traditional history and very traditional selection of yeast, but also because it brings with it a lot of interesting technological aspects. Of course, we, as usual, provide for each strains a lot of information, a lot of data sheets that you can ask to your local representative. You can easily download them in English from our website, but of course, contacting your local representative, so Lucas in your case, it will be happy to share with you a lot of information regarding all of our strains. And we've been working also on recipes, and we can share with you, of course, other feedbacks regarding these specific strains. So here you have some general information and some general context to our Lallemand brewing team. So you've got the general brewing@lallemand.com email address, but you've got also the Lucas one for more details about our yeast, and you've got also the Abbey Vickers and Siebel Institute contact. I invite you, if you haven't already done, to follow us on our social media channels such as Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. As I mentioned, we recently launched also our YouTube channel, where you can find a lot of interesting talks gave during these lockdown times, and of course I invite you also to register to our newsletter We Brew With You, where you'll be updated, of course, on all the works that we've been working on, and of course all the products that we've got on our portfolio. So I really thank you very much to your kind attention. Obrigado. And I leave time for any Q&A if there is any. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Gianmaria. Now we have some questions here, and now we're going to try to answer them. Okay, so the first one, the most voted question, they talk about pitching rate. So yep. The liquid Kveik is well known for being underpitched. So they pitch around, they say here, around 100,000 cells per ml per Plato. And how this is this feature represented for dry yeast pitch. Making the projection, he suggested that we could use 0.1 to 0.2 grams per liter to a normal wort around 13 Plato. And he asked too about the nutrients, if Cervomyces is enough. So this question is about underpitching and nutrition.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
The question is from Danilo.
Thanks, Danilo. That's a great question. Well, it can be actually true that some Kveik yeast perform well when underpitched, as I mentioned during my presentation. One thing that we have to take in consideration is that basically when we talk and we use Kveik yeast in terms of blend of different cultures, we've got the situation where we are facing actually with a co-fermentation, with a truly co-fermentation. So the condition of a single strains compared to a fermentation with other multi-strains into the wort can be the reason why the traditional Kveik perform very well when underpitched. This is something anyway that we are keeping investigating. So we are trying to run more trials. We are open to receive feedbacks from you guys, that you are the end user and the final the final producer of these trials, and we are open to get more information, more feedbacks from the field, and keep characterizing and better understand how our yeast performs. In addition to that, we can confirm. Lucas, do you have any question?
No, I just had something after you're done.
Okay. So from that point of view, of course, I can confirm that these yeasts are very robust yeast. In fact, we achieve great drying performances. They perform very well when dry pitched, so not issue at all on, let's say, managing them. Actually we we had some feedback on rehydrating the yeast, and it's so performing, it's so quickly to start to ferment, that actually the yeast during the rehydration start to overfoaming over the buckets. So I actually suggest in this case, in this specific case, to go for a dry pitch. And this, of course, confirm as well that it can perform very well in high gravity world. But of course, you have to consider it as a classic Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So when you stressing the condition too high, I mean high gravity words, too stressing condition in terms of sourness and pH, extremely high rate of hops. Of course, nutrition can be very helpful for improving the fermentation performances of this yeast. I hope I answered all your questions, Danilo. So
no, that's
thanks
the
again.
First one. We have more.
Yeah, sure.
But just adding something. So I have a customer here in Brazil that when he tried the Voss, he had a fermentation. It means bubbles in his bucket in around 20 minutes. So you can see how robust this yeast is. And
yeah,
in the lab trials,
I can confirm that.
And in the lab trials, we try until 0.3 grams per liter, and we saw that fermentation was starting to drag, was starting to be a little bit slower. So, like Gianmaria said, we are still investigating that, and we have to pay attention with some strains that you don't have a pure culture. This is a pure culture that you can repeat.
Yeah.
Okay. So going to the second question. So they ask if you have a so high temperature, how can we aerate the wort so this can have enough oxygen? And if it's possible to repeat this yeast, and if yes, for how many generations?
Okay, thanks again. Very interesting question.
Yes, this question is for Leonardo, and there is one more point. How fast can we drop the temperature, make the cold crash, without damaging the yeast? So it's 3 points. The first one about the oxygen. So how to aerate the wort in high temperatures. The second, if it's possible to repeat, if yes, for how many generations. And how we can proceed the cold crash to not damage the yeast that much.
Clear enough. So thanks Leonardo for these questions. So starting from oxygenation, I'll take the chance to answer this question, to actually apply the answer to all the other strains that we've got in our portfolio. So since we select our yeast and produce our yeast in such condition, ensuring a very high concentration of sterols and fatty acids, oxygenation during the first use of the yeast, it's not compulsory. So you can also avoid to oxygenate, aerate your wort at the first use, as it is reported also in our TDS. So if you have problem because the wort is too hot, so to retain enough oxygen into the liquid, it's not an issue at all for this yeast when used in its dry form. In terms of harvesting and repitching this yeast, of course, it is doable. As Lucas says, it's a single culture, is a single pure culture of yeast. It means that we work hard enough to select a single strains in order for those brewers that want to harvest and repeat the culture into further batches to do that. In terms of how many generations, we tested our yeast to resist and perform very well for a lot of generation, in between 6 up to 10 generations. But of course, the generation and the repeating and the purity of the yeast itself, it's strictly dependent on the brewery conditions. So how the brewers can handle the yeast and how clean the process is, what kind of quality control they can provide to the yeast once it is harvested. But in the best condition, you can go up to 10 generation quite easily, especially with such robust yeast. And sorry, I forgot the last point of the question.
Is the cold crash. So how
the cold crash? Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
when we are gonna to crop the yeast, how can we drop that temperature since we have such a huge gap to crop the yeast?
I mean, I think if I understood correctly, this is related with the harvest of the yeast as well. So how quick we can cold press the beer, not damaging the yeast itself, the vitality. I want to add a comment on that because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, during the presentation, this yeast has it's a very high flocculant yeast. And actually, most of the feedback that we received and that were reported said that the yeast drop at the bottom of the fermenter quite quickly, and it formed a very compact slurry, even before starting the cold crash. So I would suggest to in the case that you want to collect and harvest the yeast, to collect the yeast even before starting the cold crash. Then you can proceed as you usually usually do in terms of cold crashing. So you can go and cold crash in a row, or just reduce the temperature little by little if you are used to do like that.
Okay, thank you, Gianmaria. This answer is a very good suggestion. So we will escape that cold crash huge difference of temperature. So one more question. Are you good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's keep going. So this is a question from Marcelo. He's asking, in our tests, Kveik yeast produce slightly acidic beers. Is it a characteristic common to all Kveiks? Can we expect the same characteristic from Lallemand Voss Kveik?
Yes. Thanks, Marcelo. Good question again. Yes, as I mentioned, the pH drop is a quite intrinsic characteristic of this family of yeast, and of the Voss as well, of our Voss as well. Due to the fact that these yeasts are so vigorous and so performing, that they can probably produce slightly bigger amounts of organic acid. And so this means that the pH or the acidity perceived can be higher than a classic ale strains. So as I recommended during the presentation, if you want to control a little bit more the drop of the pH during the fermentation, I suggest you to start from slightly higher pH at the end of the mash or at the end of the boiling. So 0.2, 0.3 points higher than a regular one, especially when you work with hoppy beer, where you can go through the risk of having a slightly harsher or too bitterness from the hops.
Okay, thank you for the question, Marcelo. We are going to the next one now. So this question came from Renato. And he's asking, what's the minimum temperature for storage dry yeast? And how freezing the yeast takes its viability? So it's a more general question about freezing and storage in yeast.
Yeah, well, if you want to storage the yeast for short terms, we always recommend to stay in between 2 to 4 Celsius degrees, so quite low but not freezing temperature. Then, of course, Kveik is shown to be quite robust in terms of be stored on a frozen form. But of course, that depends on how quickly the freezing will take place, and quicker is better is. And I don't have actually data to share with you in terms of storage our Voss frozen, but there are a lot of interesting blog, and if you want to know a little bit more, I invite you to go on Lars Grashel blogs as well, where there are a lot of exchange in terms of how to store this yeast in different forms, in both in dry form or freezing them. I don't know if Lucas says you have something to add on the freezing storage.
What we see in our tests is that we don't see such a huge difference between freezing or storing the yeast until 4 degrees Celsius. So you can use both, and you can go as far as the expire date we have in the packs. Okay.
Nice.
Thank you, Gianmaria, and thank you, Renato, for the question. Next one comes from Leonardo. He's asking for how long we can store the yeast in a slant tube, and what's the best medium for that. So I sent a message to Tobias, and I have the answer for that one. So you want to comment first, or can I give Tobias' answer?
No, Tobias is the right guy to answer that question. So it's our chief R&D chief. So who better than him?
Yes. So in our plants, we storage these lengths up to 3 months, and we have a special our special Lallemand medium that we use, but you can use YPD. Works as good as ours. So you can use YPD, and you can keep on the fridge in slants until 3 months.
Nice.
Okay. We have one more here. Okay, so the temperature oscillation during the fermentation brings some sensory difference for the beer. For example, in a fermentation that you have different temperatures in the region during night and during the day, how does this affect the flavor of the beer?
That's a very good question. Again, well, thanks to the wide range and high tolerance in terms of fermentation gaps, this yeast perform very well, even if when it's stressed in terms of peak of temperatures. What we notice is that it's quite neutral when fermenting a lower temperature, 25, 30 Celsius degrees, and at higher temperature. So the optimum flavor profile in terms of citrusy and orangey notes have been shown to when the beer was fermented at 35, 37 Celsius degrees. This is probably coming from some intrinsic characteristic of the yeast, but also maybe due to the volatilization of some volatile compounds during the fermentation when it's too high. However, as I said, it doesn't affect that much the stress and drop in fermentation of the temperature during the fermentation, as I mentioned during one of the field trials that we had feedback on, and I reported in the slide, the fermentation, the temperature during the fermentation dropped quite aggressively and quite quickly, but there wasn't any off flavors or negative results on the beers. As well as this example, we had others during these months, and it seems to. I mean, I've been in contact with many homebrewers in Italy, and they were pretty happy about that, especially during the summer here, where there are a lot of gaps during the day or night in terms of fermentation and temperatures, and all of them reported very strong fermentations and very clean results.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. The first one is, can Kveik be a reality in breweries worldwide in the near future, as it reduces the production time and probably improve the rentability of the beer?
Yeah, well, that's great. That's our goal. So we we decided to launch it on the market because we strongly believe that. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different aspects that you can consider in using this yeast, both in terms of fermentation performances and technologies performances. So it can be, it suits very well for any kind of beer, actually. So it's just up to the brewer where to use this kind of yeast. Of course, we as Lallemand are working very hard to promote, select, and develop new strains of yeast. So in a certain way, we are very happy to bring to the whole world these very traditional yeast strains, but at the same time, we are very happy and proud to have been launching many different new strains, just because we want to bring again the diversity of yeast cultures to the brewing environment. So we'll be more than happy if Voss will be used in many breweries as possible. But at the same time, we're happy to share with you a lot of new products that year after year.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Elvis, for the question. And now another from Leonardo. I think we already talked about it, but it's good to make that point again. Voss Kveik contains just a single strain or multiple strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae?
Yeah, you can go for that, but just a single pure strain.
Yeah. So that's it. That's why it's the only actually dry Kveik's yeast in the world, and it's a pure form. So as we said before, you can even repeat that is for a few brews. Okay, what are other changes on organoleptic properties since with the higher temperature during fermentation, like the aroma?
Yeah, that's, if I understood correctly, the question is probably referring, for instance, to hoppy beer. So that's a good question. In fact, I can tell you that
no. 1 minute, Gianmaria. No? I don't think that it is about.
All right.
It is about. Is it about hoppy beers? They're just asking about general flavor changes since we ferment at high temperatures. Okay, but yes, we can talk about the.
Well, I mean,
part of
yeah,
that.
I was thinking and trying to answering that question in terms of hoppy beer, just because, of course, hoppy beer has the most common beers worldwide. And I think that hoppy beer are characterized from this great and such wide amount of volatile compounds. But as the word says, volatile means that are quite easily stripped of the product. So sometimes when you're working and trying to characterizing your beer from quite delicate flavor profile, flavor compounds, it may be better to work a lower temperature rather than go too high. That's the reason why we decided to select specifically this yeast that, as we saw, it performed well both at 20, 25 Celsius degrees up to 40 Celsius degrees. The fermentation range actually, it's an additional tool for the brewer to set and write his own recipes, depending on what they want to achieve in their finished product.
Okay, thank you, Alberto, for the question. One more question from João Vitor. I think we already answered that one, but he's asking here. There are significant differences in the secondary metabolism of the Kveik yeast between higher or lower temperatures?
Well, not directly, I would say. Maybe our team in R&D can have a better answer for that. So if we'll investigate a little bit more on that as well. But I would say that not really directly into the secondary metabolism of the yeast itself, but rather in the environment condition around the yeast. What I'm meaning here is that, of course, fermenting at 20, 25 Celsius degrees is quite in a range of a regular Saccharomyces cerevisiae for a regular beer. But of course, if you go higher up to till 15, 20 Celsius degrees higher than a regular fermentation, not only the yeast has a different can show and provide a different metabolism, but also the temperature itself can speed up some different reactions, such as I mentioned, the condensation of proteins and polyphenols, or the extraction of some oils from the hops itself that can, of course, provide and play an important role in the results and the appearance and the flavor of the finished beer. So let's say that it doesn't play a role directly, and it doesn't change that much its metabolism if it works at 25 or 40 Celsius degrees. We saw that from the Kinetics fermentation graphs, where we ferment our trials, our beers, from 20 up to 40 Celsius degrees in two different gravities worth, and the fermentation where the deatonation rate were pretty much similar. So it means that maybe it doesn't change that much its metabolism, but what changes is actually the environment around the yeast itself.
Okay, great. Thank you, João Vitor. So with this, we have two more questions. So the one that we are going to answer now is, have Kveik yeast any important role in maturation? What temperature it is most useful?
Well, that's a great question, because it depends on which style of beer you want to use, Kveik or Voss. I mean, if you're thinking about brewing a traditional farmhouse ale, the quicker the maturation is, better the beer is, because they've been produced actually traditionally very quickly, and also drunk very quickly. So they don't have any maturation or proper storage time. The traditional farmhouse Kveik ale are actually sometimes drunk when still fermenting, so not even completely fermented. On the other hand, there are some brewers that are stressing this yeast in brewing even lager beer, and of course that specific condition is completely different from what can be reached in terms of brewing a session or farmhouse beer. So the moderation, again, it's very flocculent, very stable. It's quite attenuative, so it doesn't leave behind it a huge amount of complex sugar. So the moderation and the storage of the shelf life of the beer itself is strictly dependent on the style of the beer that has been brewed used this yeast.
Okay, so the last one, I think he is talking about going back to the basics, talking about Saccharomyces cerevisiae in general in the brewing process. He's asking if it's a sexual or asexual reproduction of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain in the brewing process.
No, absolutely, asexual reproductions, because we selected our yeast so much that there are just a few Saccharomyces cerevisiae in the brewing industry that kept and are able to run asexual reproduction. Most of them are just reproducing them for asexual, for germination. So not risk for having Saccharomyces cerevisiae producing spores or any of these sexual compounds.
Okay, so I think that was it. So thank you so much, Gianmaria. Thank you again, Agraria, for giving us this space to talk a little bit about our products, our research. And now I'm giving the microphone to Rodrigo to end this whole discussion. And thank you again, Gianmaria, for helping us today.
Thank you very much to all you. My pleasure.
Pessoal, thank you again, Gianmaria, for your time, and congratulations for the presentation. Lucas, obrigado. Obrigado você, obrigado a Lallemand lá, por terem aceitado o convite para participar do nosso congresso. Pessoal, a gente está encerrando aqui essa apresentação. Daqui a pouquinho nós já vamos subir ela para o YouTube, para o canal da Agraria Malte lá no YouTube. Então quem perdeu ela, perdeu um pedaço aí, quer assistir novamente, entra lá no YouTube da Agraria Malte. As outras 12 palestras já estão lá disponíveis para vocês assistir também. Nós voltamos às 19 horas para a nossa última palestra, mais uma palestra da Lallemand, da nossa parceira, com o Mariano. O Mariano vai falar para você sobre atenuação de leveduras, e ele vai fazer a palestra dele direto de Buenos Aires, é isso, Lucas? Bom, é da Argentina. Então, pessoal, nos vemos às 19 horas, esperamos todos vocês de volta aí. Um abraço.